Hello and welcome to Anatomy with Dr. P. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the skull, and we're going to start by talking about the bones that make up the skull. The skull is formed by 22 separate bones. We're going to divide those 22 bones into two groupings. The first grouping are called the cranial bones. Cranial bones are responsible for forming the cranium of the skull, the portion of the skull that goes up and around our brain. So let's take a look at our 8 cranial bones. The first cranial bone is this one up here. It forms the forehead region and is the frontal bone. So frons is a Latin word that means forehead. So frontal is the forehead bone. Forming the top portion of the skull, so up here we can see our 2 parietal bones. Parietal comes from a Latin word that means wall. That's an important term to note because we're going to see parietal used again and again to refer to wall-like structures. So make sure that you know that term. Our next bone is this one here that forms the sides of the head. This is referred to as the temporal bone. So we can see the temporal bone here and the temporal bone here. Now, temporal, you're probably wondering what it means, and the first guess that students come up with is, well, it means temples, because that's where your temples are. Well, that leads to the question, why do we call them temples? The temporal bone comes from the Latin word temporum, which means time. So these are your time bones. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, that makes 0 sense, right? This doesn't look like a clock. I don't see a little time stamp here. Why are these called your time bones? Well, when you first start developing gray hair, the first area that gray hair shows up on is your temples. Hence the name temporal bone, because you're showing your time in this location. Now, if we look at the back of the skull, we can see this very large bone in the back. This is our occipital bone. Occipitus is a Latin word that means back of the skull. So this bone forms the very back and a large portion of the bottom of the skull. Now, to see our last 2 cranial bones, we're going to open the skull up and look inside. And as we look inside of this skull, we can see this central wedge-shaped bone. It's kind of wedged into the center. This is our sphenoid. Sphene means wedge, and oid means shaped like. So it's shaped like a wedge. Now, you might have a hard time picturing what exactly does this bone look like. Well, if we look in the center, we can see this kind of saddle-shaped structure. I'm going to grab a separate bone here. So if we line this up, we can see here's our sphenoid bone because there's the saddle-shaped structure. And if we pull it up and out, you can kind of get an idea of how weirdly shaped this bone actually is. Kind of looks like a little moth. Like there's the face and there's 2 wings that come out on each side. Our last cranial bone is located here. It attaches to the sphenoid and frontal bone. This is called the ethmoid bone. We're looking at the very top of the ethmoid bone. If we look inside of the orbit, we can see here's the ethmoid bone here. And if we look into the top of the nasal cavity, these structures up here at the top are the ethmoid bone as well. Now, you might be wondering, how do I see this bone? Because it's kind of in the center of the skull. There's a lot of other stuff in the way. So again, I'm going to grab another little model here so we can see there's the top of our ethmoid bone. If I pull it up and out, you can get a good idea of what our ethmoid bone actually looks like. So it's kind of like this little block shape. Ethmos in Greek means sieve or strainer. And the reason we call it the ethmoid bone is if this was a real skull and not plastic, we would see lots of little holes running through this ethmoid bone. So it would almost look like a strainer that you would use to drain water. Those holes are the olfactory foramina, and they run down into the nasal cavity.